Well, today's topic is the relationship between the Brazilian Expeditionary Force and the United States Army, right? The United States Fifth Army, commanded by General Mark Clark in Italy in particular, right? And I landed on the topic of this video because I'm reading this book here. See? This one is the memoirs of Marshal João Batista Mascarenhas de Moraes, the commander of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, as you probably already know. And at the same time, I'm also reading the official history of the Fourth Corps, right, by General Krittenberger, Willis Krittenberger, who was Mascarenhas de Moraes' immediate superior, and therefore the immediate superior of the Brazilians there on the Italian battlefront. So, if there's a way to properly analyze this relationship between Brazil and the United States on the battlefield, it's through these two works. Mainly, I would say, giving even more weight to it. To the official history of the Fifth Army to the official history of the Fourth Corps. Because we're talking about a unit that worked as closely as possible with the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, meaning it had direct contact with the officers, with the soldiers, with the division command. And, therefore, it's the one that should give the most accurate account, right? The highest degree of accuracy of the events involving the Expeditionary Force in Italy. I'll tell you something in advance. Surprisingly, the official history of the Fourth Corps and the memoirs of Mascarenhas de Moraes are extremely similar, okay? They are very, very much like sisters. So there isn't that excess of patriotic fervor, right? That over-the-top patriotism in Mascarenhas' memories. There isn't any. Of course, we're talking about a book in which he wrote about the main period of his military career. 20 years after it happened. It was 20 years after it happened that he wrote it. However, even though he smooths out a few edges here and there, so that not too many controversial facts make it into the pages, Mascarenhas' daily dialogue regarding his relationship with Fourth Corps is very similar to what Fourth Corps says about the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. Do you understand what I'm getting at? I also need to show you this. The general scenario, right, that led to the Brazilian Expeditionary Force's entry into combat, how Fourth Corps deployed it in combat, and also how Fourth Corps chose the Expeditionary Force, chose the Brazilian Expeditionary Force to take charge of the main objectives in its entire area of operations, Monte Castelo. Okay, what did I say? About its main operational objectives. Do you know why I'm talking about the main ones? Because the other main objective was Monte Belvedere, which was right next to it, and I'll explain why. Okay? But let's understand the situation. And look how nice this is, this Google Earth here, with all the positions already marked. Look, the dividing lines, right? The operational separation lines, and also here, the mountains and the most important locations. I've already done that. I've been using this for a while. And we're going to keep using this here in our course about Brazil in World War II. If you like this content here, you're going to love the course. But I'll tell you about it in a little while, okay? First, let's understand what these lines here on the map mean, okay? This bigger line here, look, this bigger blue line here, it means the separation of operational sectors between the Americans and the British, okay? Because here we have the U.S. Fifth Army, and here we have the British Eighth Army. So, the British Eighth Army is not our concern. Today, right, we're not going to talk about operations in this sector, no. And here in this sector, we have a smaller blue line. This smaller blue line separates the area of operations of the U.S. Second Corps, commanded by General Jeffrey Keyes, a very experienced unit. And the U.S. Fourth Corps, commanded by General Willis Grittenberger. Man, look at the size of the Fourth Corps' area. You already found that strange, right? Why is the Second Corps area small and the Fourth Corps area so big? Let me explain it to you. Look, the unit that liberated Rome, look, here's Rome. The unit that liberated Rome wasn't the Fourth Corps because the Fourth Corps didn't exist operationally in this area at that time. The unit that liberated Rome was another very experienced unit, which was the Sixth Corps. The Sixth Army Corps, commanded by Lucian Truscott, is the one that had landed here in Anzio. Had landed in Anzio at the beginning of 1944 on January 6th. They were stuck there for almost 5 months and later captured Rome. And the Sixth Corps, a highly seasoned unit, continued its advance to the Arno River. You can see here, look, the Arno River, the big river here, which passes through Florence and also passes through Pisa, right? So from this point on, man, the Sixth Army Corps came under the European Theater of Operations up in France, right? You guys know very well that since June 6, 1944, the Allies had invaded northern France. However, those who follow the war room also know that the first 2 months of operations there, or a month and a half, let's say a month and a half of operations in Normandy, were not easy. No. It was a fierce fight, right? Especially in the Caen sector. So, the Normandy line was only broken at the beginning of August. And what happens? Eisenhower, he started to get worried, right, about the number of German troops that were being sent to Normandy, right? And Eisenhower then, he determined that the Mediterranean Operations Command should plan the invasion of southern France. On what date? It is not known yet. With what material? It is not known yet, because all the material was still supporting the invasion across the English Channel, right? Let's remember here, look, for the invasion across the English Channel, the capture of the port of Cherbourg hadn't been accomplished yet. So, you also remember the storm that had destroyed the port, the Mulberry Port here in Omaha, right? The American port here in Omaha. So besides not having a real port, the Allies were relying on only a partial supply system, with the only British Mulberry Port here in Gold. Okay? That's why, man, it was extremely necessary to expand the ways to bring supplies to France by land, and also to spread out the German troops that were facing the invasion there in France. Invading southern France was necessary. Now, with what troops exactly? With which troops? Do you know with which troops? With the Sixth Army Corps. The Sixth Army Corps of Lucian Truscott. So, it was taken from here. And kept here in Livorno, reserved for the operation to invade southern France. More than that, the 5th United States Army wasn't just going to lose the 6th Corps, no. It also lost the French Expeditionary Force. Expeditionary Corps, right? 3 divisions, no, 4 divisions. 1 division, 1 Free French division, 2 Moroccan divisions, and 1 Algerian division. 4 French divisions plus the 3 divisions of Lucian Truscott, a total of 7 divisions, were taken away from Mark Clark all at once. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force then arrived in Naples down here. They arrived in Naples on July 16th, when this troop withdrawal was already taking place. Do you understand? The withdrawal of troops from the front line at the Arno here was already being carried out. So you can imagine that Mark Clark lost the bulk of his infantry overnight. He was left with nothing, man. He was left with just a corps, which was the Second Corps, with infantry. And to replace the Sixth Corps that was leaving under Lucian Truscott, that's when the Fourth Corps was activated in Rome. But the Fourth Corps was originally created as an armored corps. In fact, its commander was Willis Crittenberger, a tank officer and a protege of George Patton. Eisenhower didn't like Crittenberger, so he sent Crittenberger, let's say he exiled Crittenberger, to Italy, giving him command of the Fourth Corps. When Crittenberger arrived in Italy, he took command of the Army Corps with only 2 divisions, the 1st Armored Division of the United States and the 6th Armored Division of South Africa. Just those 2, no infantry. Now what will happen? Here around August. So, in the end, in September, the Jagdgeschwader 77 JG-77, the last German fighter unit operating in Italy, was pulled back to Germany. It was sent to Germany to fight in the Reichsverteidigung, which was the air defense of the Reich. Right? What was left of the fighters in Italy? Only the 2 A&R groups were left, right? Defending here the airfields that protected the industrial areas of northern Italy. In other words, it wasn't an interception force, right? As diverse as the JG-77 was. So the anti-aircraft units in this area here of the Fifth Army, due to the sharp drop in enemy air activity, ended up being considered superfluous. All those anti-aircraft batteries that didn't have any more work, what happened to them? In the heat of the moment, all those anti-aircraft units, those men there, were turned into an improvised infantry unit called Task Force 45. Task Force 45, which fell under the command of a brigadier general named Paul Rutledge, a guy who also wouldn't prove to be very good either. But what does all of this have to do with the FEB? Take a look. In the meantime, man, the FEB on July 16th had arrived in Naples because it was supposed to go right by international agreement between Brazil and the United States. It was supposed to go to Algeria, and it was supposed to go train in Algeria to complete its training in Algeria. Mascarenhas had gone to North Africa and to Italy, and he had met Eisenhower in Algeria in December of 43. And he got Eisenhower's agreement to receive the FEB in Algeria, to complete the FEB's training in Algeria, and to send it to Italy as a combat force, ready to go to the front line. Did that happen? No. Why? Because with the Allied High Command's decision to send all those divisions from Clark to southern France, Clark was left without infantry, and he told the Brazilian Expeditionary Force to come straight to Italy. No stopping in Algeria. No, go straight to Italy. But Clark's order wasn't followed by any directive that would make the Brazilian Expeditionary Force join the Fifth Army. He called the troops to Italy, but the troops arrived in Italy without weapons because that was the agreement between Brazil and the United States. They weren't supposed to bring weapons, contrary to what you might hear out there. A lot of nonsense you hear, but they really weren't supposed to bring weapons. They arrived in Italy, but then, how are you guys assigned here? Do you know why? Because you don't just arrive in Italy and receive all kinds of weapons, vehicles, ammunition, and supplies if you're not a combat unit. Since there was no assignment, the first contingent of the Expeditionary Force spent about a month in Italy simply doing physical training because Clark hadn't given the order to assign the FEB. It was only in the month of August that the FEB received this assignment. Within Krittenberger's 4th Corps, which, as you can see here, was responsible for a huge area, because the 6th Corps and the French Expeditionary Force were gone, so all of this was left for the 4th Corps, which went on to occupy this line. Without infantry, only with TF-45, only with Task Force 45 as an emergency force there. And a lot of people say that the Buffalo Division, the 92nd Division of segregated black soldiers, arrived before the FEB. But what really arrived before the FEB on the front line, okay? It was the 370th Regiment, just the regiment, the precursor regiment of the division, the 370th Regiment, just like the 6th Infantry Regiment. The 370th Regiment was the precursor to the FEB. It arrived in Italy, and look, it arrived in Italy after the FEB and was thrown into the front line before the FEB. 2 weeks after the soldiers of the 92nd Division from the 370th Regiment landed, set foot in Italy, they were already on the front line. Why? Because they left the United States with complete training and arrived in Italy already integrated into the 4th Corps. Therefore, they were quickly placed on the front line. The FEB was not. 2 problems. Clark wasn't clear in his orders. He simply told them to come to Italy, but he didn't integrate them into the 4th Corps. Immediately after, the 6th Infantry Regiment arrived in Italy without combined arms training. They didn't have that training. Combined arms training is the second stage of a soldier's training. He had individual training that was done in Rio de Janeiro very well, even with inadequate weapons, because they weren't the same weapons they would use in Italy. But it was done in Rio de Janeiro, more or less, but it was done. But the combined arms training, man, which really requires the actual weapons to be used on the front line and also coordination with armored vehicles, with artillery, with plenty of artillery assets available for training, could only be done in Italy. So the FEB had these 2 problems. So what will happen then? After a month in Italy, they will be taken to the city of Tarquinia, which is just a little north of Rome, near Civitavecchia, actually right here. This is where the FEB receives all the equipment, the trucks, the cannons, all of that, and then it will move to Vada, here in the region of Pisa, Vada. Here in Vada, for 3 weeks at the end of August and the beginning of September, the combined arms training of the 6th Regiment of the 1st Echelon will take place, the São Paulo Echelon. And what about the FEB? It will be deployed in the sector that had already been guarded since August. It will be deployed 3 weeks later. The 370th Regiment, the Black Regiment. Massa is a city located right here. See Massa. This city here, so a coastal city, is where the FEB will replace the 370th Regiment on September 16th. Conquering Massa Rosa, conquering Camaiore. Mount Prano here. And finally making the so-called rotation, right? Moving from here to enter this valley that you see here. Look, which valley is it? It's the valley of the Serchio River. And here is where she will conquer Borgo Amozano, will conquer Fornat, will conquer Barga, and finally will try to capture Castel Nuovo di Garfagnana. Right here, look, which was the main nerve center of the German logistics in the sector, right? In this period, yeah, man, in this period, yeah. The 370th Black Regiment was taken from here and moved over here while the FEB was receiving combat inoculation. It was taken here and placed right here, look, in front of Gaia de Montano. Together with TF-45, together with Task Force 45, okay? Why were they here? Because this was the focus of attention of the 4th Army Corps. This yellow road you're seeing here cutting through is Highway 64, the famous Highway 64, which leads all the way to Bologna. Bologna is already in the Po River Valley. Well, right here, right? The Po River Plain, actually. And it cuts through the mountains, right? So in other words, the approach route to Bologna, man, is Highway 64, and from here to here is the area of the Second Corps. Let me show you something here. The port where all the equipment and all the supplies are unloaded is Livorno. So you need to move all the supplies by road along Highway 64 to get to Bologna. So you need Highway 64 open along its entire length. This means that there are here 2 points in the area of the Fourth Corps. The first 2 points. When the road curves here from south to north, then it turns to the northeast. Right here in the region of Silla and just a little bit over here, right? A bit more to the east. This whole area of the road was within range of the German artillery, right here from German observation posts at Monte Castelo and Monte Belvedere. Okay, Monte Castelo and Monte Belvedere. These 2 hills here, right? That's why Monte Castelo was crucial. That's why Monte Belvedere was crucial, okay? What does this have to do with Brazil? Here's the thing, man. October 30th, 1900.
900
October 30th, 1944. Zenobio da Costa was commanding the regimental combat team of the FEB here, right, from the 6th Regiment here in the Serchio Valley. Wanting to make one last offensive to capture Castelnuovo di Garfagnana, Mascarenhas de Moraes leaves the area and goes here to the conference at the headquarters, right, of the 5th Army here at the Futa Pass. Futa Pass, right here. Look, so that's where the Futa Pass conference will be held. And the Futa Pass conference is what will shape the history of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force as we know it today. Want to know how? But look, for you to understand all of this that I'm telling you here, look, this here is based on reading. Okay, it's based on historiography. All of this is serious. Not that AI garbage you've been feeding on, eating that stuff on YouTube. Okay? A video generated by artificial intelligence, with a script generated by artificial intelligence and bibliography generated by artificial intelligence. No, that's nonsense. And if you want to get rid of that, if you're a teacher and want to walk into the classroom with the confidence that you know this whole story I'm telling you here, right? So you can walk into the classroom and answer your students' questions with confidence. If you want to write scripts, write books, collect, learn about uniforms, or if you just like history, join our course Brazil in World War II from SDG Academy. Classes will take place from May 26th until July 16th. That's right, twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8 p.m. If you can't watch live, you can watch the recorded version later. If you want to watch live, you can. So what do? Link in the description or scan the QR code that's on the screen. You can pay with Pix or you can pay with a credit card, split into up to 12 installments. A tiny little installment like this, look, so you can finally understand the real story of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, okay? And distance yourself from the crowd that just guesses and wastes oxygen, all right? That's the message I have to give you here in the middle of the video, man. This course is unmissable for you who really want to learn the true story of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force in World War II. Because besides the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, it will also include the Brazilian Air Force, right? The 1st Fighter Group, all right? And also the Brazilian Navy, but for that you need to study seriously with me in this course. Okay, that's the message. Click there and sign up, all right? Continuing here, why is the Paso de Futa Conference on October 30, 1944 so important for the history of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force? Because in this conference, Mark Clark calls his corps commanders. That is, from the 2nd Corps and the 4th Corps. Jeffrey Keyes and also Willis Krittenberger. He also invites, or rather summons, all the division commanders. Mascarenhas de Moraes, General Almond, and all the others, okay? And he tells them the following. The objective of the U.S. Fifth Army is to capture Bologna before Christmas, man. To capture Bologna before Christmas. This was on October 30th. In other words, there are effectively 2 months left until the end of the year, less than 2 months until Christmas. Mark Clark put his foot down and said Bologna before Christmas. And how was that going to happen, man, for God's sake? How was that really going to happen? That could only happen one way. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force would be withdrawn from here, from the Sergio Valley. And many people said that it was only withdrawn after the counterattack on the 31st, not the next day. It had already been chosen. Its transfer to the Reno Valley had already been determined, to the hottest sector of the front line. To be able to capture the main objective, it had already been scheduled to be withdrawn before the counterattack, okay? Because of Clark's plan for Bologna before Christmas. And then not only was the 6th Regiment withdrawn from here to there, man, not only was it withdrawn, but also the fate of the other 2 regiments. Of the 1st Infantry Regiment and the 11th Infantry Regiment, right? The rest of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, which had arrived in Italy on October 6th and landed in Livorno on October 15. And now they were camped here, look, in the outskirts of Pisa, waiting for the start of the combined arms training, which was extremely necessary for the soldier to understand how war works, how war proceeds. Otherwise, you're just taking guys who receive physical training, physical preparation in Brazil, back at the Vila Militar in Rio de Janeiro, and throwing them in. Him against the German army in the worst combat area of the Fifth Army. At this Futa Pass conference, the 1st and 11th Regiment, the other 10,000 men of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, it was decided that they would be taken out of Pisa without combined arms training and sent straight to the front line. But Mascarenhas de Moraes protests against the decision. The history of the 4th Corps of the United States Army mentions the Brazilians at several points, highlighting them on several occasions. The Brazilians of the 2nd Contingent arrived at the front line without any training, man, without any training, man. That reflects what Willis Krutenberger likely thought too, that this was wrong. Taking them from the camp area and bringing them to the front line without training. You know why that is? Because Clark had already decided he wanted Bologna before Christmas, right? That's a political objective that probably came from Washington. Because at that same time, the Market Garden operation up there in Holland had failed. And that was everyone's bet. Victory before Christmas, Berlin before Christmas. Look, it was over. So the American press started to cool down, right? A bit more lukewarm regarding the progress of the war, and having a victory, at least in the Italian theater of operations, of this scale would improve the government's image, right? So probably Clark was acting under pressure from Washington, okay? That's what I think today. And what does Clark do? At the very end of November, he orders the other 2 regiments to come to the front line area. And why the 2 regiments? Damn, wasn't there another American Army Corps here? So why couldn't they take those troops and launch the attack here, man? You know why? Because the 2nd Corps had been in action since the previous year, man. The 2nd Corps had been on the front line since Monte Cassino, since the Monte Cassino line, right? They did all that, and the divisions were extremely tired, extremely exhausted, with heavy casualties needing refit, needing to be replenished. And it would be exactly as you can see here. Look, the divisions of the 2nd Army Corps that would make the final offensive against Bologna in December. You see? It would be them then on October 30th. Mark Clark decided that the divisions of the 2nd Corps should go to the rear, get the necessary rest, while the divisions of the 4th Corps would open the road needed to bring supplies to Bologna. Now, finally, do you understand? Now you understand. It can't be clearer than this. But the infantry of the 4th Corps is basically made up of Brazilian infantry, man. They have a single regiment from the 92nd Division, okay? Because the other 2 regiments that had arrived there at the end of September were now being placed here in the low-intensity area to be inoculated. The Brazilian regiment, which already had experience in the 6th Regiment, was transferred here to the Monte Castelo area. The African American Regiment was also transferred here, as I mentioned, in Gado and Montano, and here, in front of Monte Belvedere, Task Force 45 was placed, the task force of American anti-aircraft artillerymen, so that after 45 days of direct combat, the 3 battalions of the 6th Regiment on November 24, 1944,
44.
they were sent to attack the observation post at Monte Belvedere, Monte Castelo, while the 370th Regiment was engaged in combat here against Gado, Montano, and the surrounding areas. Task Force 45, the anti-aircraft artillerymen, were sent into combat against Monte Belvedere. Of course, you couldn't use all 3 battalions that the FEB had at the time, right? All 3 at the same time? So, only 1 battalion was deployed here, 1 battalion here, and 1 battalion here. You have to understand that these 3 were regimental forces. So they don't attack all at once. You have to attack with 1 battalion and keep 2 in reserve. That way the FEB attacks Monte Castelo with a small force. A single battalion can't advance. The 370th with just 1 battalion can't advance, and Task Force 45 with a battalion but with better armored support advances. They take the surroundings of Belvedere, and the next day they take Belvedere, November 25th. So what happens next? The men from São Paulo in the 6th Regiment are already completely exhausted at this point in the battle, right? They've already been on the front line for more than 2 months without a break. And Mascarenhas on November 29th, so 4 days later, he is ordered to make a new attempt to take Monte Castelo. A new attempt. But Mascarenhas can only use battalions from the 1st Infantry Regiment, right? Battalions from the 1st and the 11th, completely inexperienced. And to make things worse, the day before, November 28th, the Germans retook Monte Belvedere from the Americans right here, look. And then all the artillery comes down on the Brazilian Expeditionary Force here. Even so, November 30th arrives. There are 25 days left until Christmas. Mark Clark didn't give up. He still wants Bologna before Christmas. But the road is covered by German artillery fire, so no supplies are coming up. What's going to happen? Mark Clark orders another attack against Monte Castelo. At this point, Belvedere becomes secondary. And Clark is already waiting, because he took the Black Regiment from here and sent it over here to the Serchio Valley, sent it to the Serchio Valley, and here the Black American Regiment. He will face a counterattack on December 26, right? The Christmas offensive there in Soma Colonia, right here. From then on, man, the 92nd Buffalo Division, the American one, it's considered second line. It will only be considered fit for defensive and patrol actions, right? The Brazilian Expeditionary Force is also a division, let's say, without combat experience, right? Completely inexperienced. It's already treated as a high-value division, and it's assigned to take the main objective chosen between the two, okay? Let's say we're attacking an objective, which is what we have troops for here, right? Which one of the two are we going to choose? Let's choose Monte Castelo because it's more important. Come on, if you're going to attack an objective, you have two, right? Belvedere and Castello are the two objectives, but you only have enough troops to attack one. So what do? You attack the more important one, Monte Castelo. This is just for you who keep talking nonsense, saying that Monte Castelo was secondary, that Monte Castelo is. No, Monte Castelo was chosen by the Fifth Army above Belvedere as the main objective of the attack attempt on December 12th. But Mascarenhas had to go get new rookie units, which were still intact, right? Keep in mind that there's still the whole issue of casualties. And you can't use the same battalion forever because you'll wear the battalion down. The battalions suffer casualties, so you have to rotate the battalions on the front line. And it's worth remembering that, the FEB's first replenishment echelon, right? That first replacement echelon from the personnel depot only got there in Italy at the beginning of December, man. When this was happening, then really Mascarenhas had no way to replace the casualties up to that point. So that's why he always had to use rookie battalions, even to instill, right? And what about the baptism by fire? And what happened on December 12th? Bad weather. Light rain, low clouds. The Germans, already wary after the attempt to take the hill on the 29th, reinforced the defense of the hill, put up barbed wire, dug more bunkers, and set up a minefield. So, man, this place turned into hell. A cauldron and the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, once again being forced to attack with inexperienced units, can't capture the hill, okay? So do you think the 4th Army Corps criticized the Brazilian Expeditionary Force because it wasn't able to capture Monte Castelo? No. If you knew English and went to read the official history, you would see that it says the following, that all the conditions, possible negative conditions, were stacked against the FEB. And because of all these reasons and because of the inexperience of the troops, who were forced to go to the front line without the training, the objective was not taken. Okay? So, man, you get to the end of the year, and after December 12th, it's Krittenberger himself who says that's it. Krittenberger says, I can't do it anymore. It's over. There's no way to keep going. Why? Because on December 12th, the advance elements of the 1st Regiment of the 10th Mountain Division, which were already on their way to Italy, hadn't arrived yet. So there was no way you could keep that promise to take Bologna before Christmas. With the road blocked, sacrificing troops that have no training, which are the only troops you have. So Krittenberger says, there will be no more offensive operations for the rest of the year. And Krittenberger himself states in the official history of the 4th Corps that the 4th Corps takes responsibility for the training of the new Brazilian regiments to speed up the training of these soldiers so they can become soldiers fit for war. Do you understand? So the complexity of these relationships, I know they're not clear, but I'm impressed, man, how these books aren't new books, you know? These are conclusions that have been available for decades, and it's my fault too, man. I'll admit it's my fault because I've already read A Febe por seu Comandante. It's always the first book I recommend to anyone starting to read about the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. And another thing I recommend, I don't recommend, I had already read the book by Mara Matos, you know, Marshal Mascarenhas de Moraes, His Era. And for some reason, I confused this book by Mara Matos, this biography of Mascarenhas by Mara Matos, with the memoirs of General Mascarenhas, of Marshal Mascarenhas. And I hadn't read this book yet. And now that I'm taking the opportunity to read both the history of the Fourth Corps and also the memoirs of Mascarenhas at the same time, bam, the complete picture appeared before me. That's why I'm sharing it with you. Did you like finding this out? Did you already know about this? Tell us here in the comments. And don't miss the chance to learn this and much more in our course. Brazil in World War II. Man, don't miss your chance to take the course with us to learn everything from A to Z. Everything about the Expeditionary Force.